In room 55 of the British Museum in London, behind the thick protective glass of a display case, lies an ancient tablet catalogued as BM 78941. This historical artifact is quite modest in size, measuring approximately 5.3 inches in height and about 3.5 inches in width. This piece of fired clay weighs just under 1.1 pounds, making it easy to imagine it resting in the palm of your hand. The surface of the object is densely covered with minute wedge-shaped marks that were pressed into the soft material thousands of years ago with a sharp stylus. These symbols form a text known today to researchers as the Epic of Atrahasis, describing the specific process of the creation of the human race. If you look closely at this object, you will immediately notice the incredible precision and meticulousness of the ancient Mesopotamian scribes' work. Each individual symbol is carved with such care, as if the author were filling out a poetic scroll, but strict technical documentation or a detailed report. Museum specialists constantly maintain the temperature in the hall at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent the destruction of the fragile ancient structure. This artifact was found during excavations, hidden under layers of earth several dozen feet below the surface. I looked at it for a long time before allowing myself to ask the obvious question. The text on this tablet tells a story that is radically different from the abstract myths we are accustomed to about the divine breath of life. It explicitly states that man was designed through the artificial physical union of two completely different bloodlines and structural lines. The first line consists of local earthly material, which the text refers to as clay, serving as the basic physical matrix. The second line is taken from the blood of a divine being who clearly did not belong to this world and was intentionally sacrificed. The text repeats with mathematical insistence that these two distinct components must be mixed to create a new, viable hybrid. The description of this process contains terminology that bears no resemblance to the language of religious worship or traditional spiritual poetry. We read about specific procedures for purifying biological material, about adhering to strict proportions, and about a sequence of actions carried out under sterile conditions. The Mother Goddess receives crystal-clear instructions from the project's chief engineer on how to properly combine these inherently incompatible elements. The result of this genetic mixing is a being that must carry the traits and functions of both original donors. Reading these lines, you can't help but wonder why the ancient author chose such a mechanistic approach to describing a sacred act. The concept of humanity's dual origin recurs in this ancient epic with alarming regularity throughout its many carved lines. The local earthly foundation was meant to provide a physical form capable of surviving and functioning under the gravitational and climatic conditions of our planet. The blood of the slain god, according to the text, provides what the Sumerians called Temu, a term often translated as personality or mind. However, in the context of the described manipulations, this term more closely resembles a kind of basic instruction, structural code, or program for the organism's development. You may notice how this duality is constantly emphasized, as if the scribe wanted to ensure that the reader would understand the artificiality of this union. The story begins with a description of a world in which the lesser gods are forced to perform hard physical labor on the planet's surface. The text states that they dug riverbeds and built infrastructure, carrying loads weighing hundreds and thousands of pounds daily. Eventually, these workers stage a revolt, refusing to continue their grueling work in the face of high temperatures and arduous labor. To prevent a large-scale conflict, the higher-ups decide to create an entirely new type of worker capable of taking on these duties. It is at this very moment that the need arises to develop a hybrid creature that would be intelligent enough to work, but bound to the earth. To carry out this project, a specific god named Ve'ila was chosen, whose blood was to serve as the foundation for the new species. The text does not describe his death as an accident or a punishment, but rather as a deliberate technological decision to obtain the necessary material. His essence was extracted from his body with a frightening methodicalness that we usually associate with laboratory protocols rather than mythology. This extracted substance was intended to impart to the future human the ability to hear commands and understand assigned tasks on an intellectual level. What you see here is not merely a magical creation, but a process of purposeful transfer of properties from one being to another through blood. After obtaining the divine component, the phase of preparing the local earthen material begins, which was to serve as a receptacle for this blood. The clay mentioned in the epic is not mere mud gathered from the nearest body of water, but is described as a specially prepared substrate. The text indicates that this material base had to be purified and brought into harmony with the divine element. Only after the thorough preparation of the two components could the Mother Goddess begin the process of their direct fusion into a single biological form. All these actions take place in a special chamber, often translated as the House of Destiny, where a strict order of procedures is observed. When the two materials finally unite, the epic describes the emergence of a pulsation or heartbeat, which the text calls a drumbeat. This physiological rhythm is declared direct proof that the mixing of two different genetic lines was successful and the form has come to life. The drumbeat of the slain god's blood is now forever sealed within earthly flesh, creating an unbreakable bond between two incompatible worlds. The ancient scribe devotes immense attention to this moment, as if recording the successful completion of a complex scientific experiment in species hybridization. There is no room for chance in this description. Every action has its clear cause and observable physical consequence. What exactly was the man trying to document as he painstakingly pressed these wedge-shaped marks into a piece of clay thousands of years ago? Why did he choose the language of strict instructions and biological mixing to describe what should have been simply a beautiful fairy tale? Why did the text feel the need to emphasize so insistently that our nature is composed of two distinct parts, one of which is alien to Earth? These details are so specific and stand out from the general body of ancient legends that they compel us to view the artifact in a completely different light. Why is the process of creating life described here not as a miracle, but as a complex and almost surgical act of construction using donor materials? Official science offers a perfectly rational and thoroughly developed explanation for this ancient text and its unusual content. Historians, archaeologists, and linguists classify the tale of Atrahasis as a classic cosmogonic myth, characteristic of the early agrarian societies of Mesopotamia. Within this academic paradigm, the creation of humankind is viewed as an elegant metaphorical solution to a social problem among fictional gods. The hardships of the lesser deities digging irrigation canals symbolize the real daily struggles of the first farmers who fought for survival in a harsh climate. The mixing of divine blood and ordinary earthly clay is interpreted by scholars as a profound poetic allegory of humanity's inseparable connection with nature. This interpretation is well-founded. It logically situates the text within the historical context of human society's development, where myths served as a vital instrument of social stability. Ancient people were directly dependent on the earth that yielded crops, so they naturally believed that their physical bodies were created from the local soil. They also possessed a complex mind that distinguished them from livestock, and they attributed this unique gift to the intervention of higher powers. The use of the metaphor of sacrificial blood perfectly explains the dual nature of human life, which combines higher thought with inevitable physical mortality. The academic community has spent decades painstakingly studying every cuneiform sign in this monumental epic. Eminent linguists have reconstructed the highly complex grammar and syntax of the Akkadian language so that we can read these texts with great accuracy. At prestigious universities around the world, this epic is taught as an indisputable masterpiece of ancient Near Eastern literature and early religious thought. Archaeological excavations confirm that such texts were regularly copied in scribal schools over many centuries as standard textbooks. This scholarly status quo is supported by thousands of published peer-reviewed articles, monographs, and detailed historical reference works. However, there is one significant problem in this coherent and logical academic framework that requires closer attention. It fails to explain the following. When we analyze specific lines concerning the process of mixing elements, the metaphorical meaning begins to rapidly unravel under the weight of excessive detail. The text devotes a disproportionate amount of attention to the strict physiological and structural aspects of this fusion, describing specific phases of material preparation. If this is merely a beautiful poetic allegory for uneducated peasants, then the excessive medical detail of the process is devoid of any practical or literary meaning. Let us turn our attention to a specific section of the translation that describes the process of preparing the blood of the slain deity before its use. The epic explicitly states that the god's flesh and blood must be thoroughly purified before being mixed directly with clay. This action is described using specific verbs that in the Akkadian language are used for the physical separation and filtration of real substances. Why would an abstract spiritual entity require a complex physical purification procedure before being used as a metaphor for the human soul? This specific technical detail does not fit at all within the framework of a simple theological tale about gods and humans. Traditional analysis also ignores the emphasis on adhering to the strict time frame that the text establishes for the development of the created hybrid. The epic indicates that after the mixing of blood and clay, the resulting material must undergo a maturation phase lasting exactly 10 lunar months. The text describes how the goddesses oversee this period, keeping precise track of time and monitoring the development of the physical form. A poetic metaphor does not require such precise timing or references to obstetric procedures, which are described with frightening realism. What you see before you is a description of the standard biological cycle of pregnancy, embedded in a story about cosmic engineering. Furthermore, the official interpretation often sidesteps the question of why the gods needed to mix two components in the first place. If they possessed boundless magical power, they could have simply spoken a word or fashioned a human from a single material. The persistent mention that divine blood acts as an active binding agent for inert clay seems too functional. The text explains that without the god's blood, the form would be unable to maintain its structure or perform complex mental operations. This reads not like a religious hymn, but like an explanation of the chemical or genetic dependence of one element on another. Even the very description of the room where this act of creation takes place raises questions for the attentive researcher of ancient texts. The epic mentions a room where outsiders are strictly forbidden and where special conditions of purity are maintained. The chief god Enki personally oversees the process, acting not as an omnipotent creator, but as the chief specialist in working with biological substances. The mother goddess Nintu acts as a lab technician, following his instructions on measuring out the correct portions of the materials to be mixed in order to achieve the desired result. Why did the ancient author feel the need to place the gods under strict protocols and a division of labor when creating humanity? All these facts make one wonder how fully official science understands the true meaning of cuneiform records. We are accustomed to projecting our own understanding of religion onto ancient cultures, expecting to see familiar metaphors and tales in their texts. But if we remove these interpretive filters, we will see a dry, almost sterile account of the construction of a new form of life. The details do not serve to embellish the text, they are its essence, conveying information about a specific structural intervention in biology. Why does modern science prefer to call this simply poetry, ignoring the ancient author's clearly technical language? Perhaps acknowledging that ancient texts contain descriptions of actual hybridization procedures requires too radical a re-evaluation of our history. It is much safer to place these tablets in the category of myths and study them exclusively as a development of human imagination and literature. But the clay documents themselves continue to lie in museum display cases, preserving a completely different history in their imprinted symbols. They tell of a time when the blood of one who was not of this planet was deliberately introduced into an earthly vessel. And this process is described with such precision that it cannot be attributed to the mere imagination of ancient shepherds and farmers. The artifact is part of the permanent collection of the renowned University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, cataloged as CBS 13532. It is a small fragment of an ancient text that was discovered during extensive excavations of the sacred Sumerian city of Nippur. The excavations took place at the very end of the 19th century, when American archaeologists unearthed thousands of tablets from beneath layers of dry sand. The ancient city of Nippur was located on a plain about 100 miles south of where modern-day Baghdad now stands. Temperatures in this region often exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, which was ideal for the natural preservation of fired clay. Mainstream scholarship confidently asserts that this specific text is one of the earliest versions of the motif of shaping a human from clay. Historians view it as the foundation for all subsequent Middle Eastern religions, in which a deity acts as a cosmic potter. This interpretation makes sense, since clay was the primary and most accessible building material in Mesopotamia, and the analogy is obvious. Ancient people built houses from it, made pottery, and wrote on it, so the idea that they themselves were made of clay is quite natural. Within this theory, the text is simply a reflection of the everyday life of ancient society, transposed to the scale of the deeds of the gods. But the description of the process of preparing this so-called clay uses a term that goes far beyond simple pottery. A careful reading of the original Akkadian text shows that the clay here is not gathered from the ground, but is chipped off or fragmented in a specific way. The original uses the specific verb karasu, which literally translates as to pinch off a piece of flesh, or to separate a biological fragment. Why is a verb typically used in medical or surgical contexts for flesh being applied to describe working with clay? This choice of words radically changes the perception of the process, transforming it from the shaping of a jug into the manipulation of living tissue. The text goes even further, describing that this material must be divided into 14 equal portions before the process begins. 7 fragments of this matrix are set aside on the right side, while the other 7 fragments are placed on the left side of the room. A special brick barrier is erected between these two groups of materials, which, as the text indicates, serves to isolate them from one another. If this is simply clay for molding, why is such strict separation and isolation of the material batches required during the process? What you see here is not a potter's workshop, but a procedure for preparing incubation matrices to create 2 different genders of a new kind. The clay itself, which is the subject of discussion, is described as a substrate that must absorb an introduced external substance. The text refers to this material as teeter, a term denoting not merely soil, but a special mixture capable of sustaining life. Into this carefully sorted and portioned matrix, The purified blood of a slain deity is then introduced to initiate development. We see a description of how terrestrial biological material is used as a reservoir or carrier for alien genetic information. This structurally resembles the process of implanting modified embryos into artificial or surrogate wombs for the subsequent independent gestation of hybrids. This most important artifact is currently on display in the Middle Eastern Antiquities Galleries of the Louvre Museum in Paris under catalog number A04023. It is a magnificently preserved Assyrian tablet that was discovered in the library of King Ashurbanipal during excavations of ancient Nineveh. The ruins of this majestic city lie about 250 miles north of ancient Babylon, on the banks of the Tigris River. The expedition recovered these texts from beneath the rubble of a palace that had been destroyed by a fire, which transformed the tablets into a durable ceramic material. These fired pages document in detail the process of extracting that very component which did not belong to the Earth's biosphere. Official academic sources assert that the scene of the gods' murder to create humanity is a classic example of ritual sacrifice in mythology. Scholars believe that the transfer of blood symbolizes the transfer of life energy and divine patronage to the new creation so that it might serve the gods. This explanation is consistent. It is also universally applied as a way to never ask whether a statement is true. If any description of working with blood is called a ritual allegory, then there is no need to analyze the technical terms describing the extraction process itself. But in this text, the bloodletting procedure is described not as a mystical ritual, but as a precise and functional anatomical operation. The god named Veila, who was chosen as the donor, is described as one who possesses Temu, a specific plan or personality. When his blood is mixed with clay, the text explicitly states, "Let the god and the man be mixed together in this clay." The Akkadian original uses the verb balalu, which means the physical and irreversible mixing of two liquids or substances into a homogeneous state. There is no mention of a spiritual blessing here. What is documented is the process of the irreversible fusion of two different biological materials at the cellular level. Let's look at the exact translation of the term used to describe what exactly is transmitted through this divine blood. The text states that Idamu must remain from the flesh of the god, which is traditionally translated as spirit or incorporeal ghost. However, the root of this word points to something structural, to memory or information that is preserved after the destruction of the physical shell. This information is embedded in the clay so that the future human being receives instructions on how to assemble their consciousness and understand the surrounding world. Blood here functions not as a mystical fluid, but as a physical carrier of information, programming the earthly matrix for the desired result. The text repeatedly emphasizes that without this intervention, the clay would have remained lifeless or would have resulted in the creation of an inferior being. Earthly material alone did not possess sufficient complexity to form an intellect capable of understanding the complex commands of the architect gods. It was precisely the alien blood, brought in from outside, that set in motion the process that transformed simple biomass into a functional and intelligent worker. The ancient author documented the fact that the human mind is not a product of local earthly evolution, but was implanted. You may read this as a ghost story, but the language of the text persistently describes an operation to transfer genetic code. This text fragment can be found in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, where it is kept in a specialized repository for cuneiform. The tablet is known among specialists as an old Babylonian copy of the Epic of Atrahasis, dating to approximately the 17th century BCE. It was acquired in the early 20th century from antiquities dealers who were excavating the ruins of ancient Sippar in southern Mesopotamia. This city once stood on the banks of the Euphrates, covering an area of several hundred acres filled with temples and scribes' libraries. On the surface of this small piece of clay is one of the strangest physiological descriptions in the history of the ancient world. The official position of linguists is that the mention of a heartbeat in this text is simply a poetic metaphor for the awakening of life. They argue that ancient authors simply associated life with the beating of the heart, which is why they included this sound in the description of creation. This interpretation makes sense, since a heartbeat is indeed the most obvious sign of life for any observer in any era. The ancient peoples of Mesopotamia regularly sacrificed animals and had a thorough understanding of how the circulatory system works and how the heart beats. Therefore, the inclusion of this image in the text seems like a perfectly natural literary device for describing a piece of lifeless clay coming to life. But in the text, this rhythm is described not simply as a sign of life, but as a residual phenomenon passed on from the slain donor. The original uses the word upu, which translates as drum or drumbeat, and it has a specific structural meaning. The text literally reads, "Let there be a drum in the flesh of the god, let it become a sign for the living, so that the spirit is not forgotten." This rhythm is described as a physical manifestation of the divine component, which is now forever locked inside the human's created earthly shell. It is not merely the hybrid's heartbeat, it is a continuous signal attesting to the presence of alien blood in his physiological system. Moreover, this drumbeat is described as something that prevents the forgetting or destruction of that very informational structure, etamu. The sound of the rhythm acts as a mechanism of synchronization or support, allowing the embedded divine memory to function within the earthly material vessel. If this were mere poetry, the author would not need to explain the functional purpose of the heartbeat as a memory retention system. The ancient scribe notes a technical detail. The pulsation is necessary so that the embedded code does not disintegrate and continues to function within the hybrid. You see a description of an autonomous life support system that was programmed to constantly maintain the activity of the implanted foreign element. The text emphasizes that this rhythm will continue as long as humanity exists, passing from generation to generation. It has become an integral part of our species, a structural legacy of that mixing operation that took place in the laboratory of the ancient gods. Scientists see this as a beautiful fable about the soul, but the specific words of the text speak of a functioning biological mechanism of integration. This drum is physical proof that our circulatory system carries within it something more than just local evolution. It serves as a constant reminder that our basic matrix was modified by a component that came from outside. This incredible cuneiform inscription is housed at the Museum of the Near East in Berlin under the strict catalog number VAT17019. The text is part of an extensive collection of myths about Enki and Ninmah, describing the final stage of the creation of the human species following the mixing. These tablets were extracted from deep layers of excavations in the early 20th century and carefully transported to European archives. These stone and clay archives weighed tens of tons, but it is this small fragment that contains the most striking information. It documents in detail and step by step the process of gestating hybrid embryos until their final physical birth. Official academic science interprets these lines as a mythological description of the natural process of pregnancy, clothed in the fairy tale form of the goddess's involvement. Experts claim that the numbers and time frames specified in the text simply reflect ancient astronomical and medical knowledge about childbirth. This interpretation is logical, since ancient societies needed a basic understanding of pregnancy cycles for survival and successful childbirth. The involvement of the midwife goddesses can easily be explained as the personification of natural forces that helped women during difficult and dangerous childbirth in ancient times. Thus, the text is considered an early medical treatise mixed with religious hymns in honor of motherhood and fertility. But in this interpretation, there is a complete disconnect regarding exactly how the location and conditions of this strange pregnancy are described. The text explicitly states that the 14 mixed pieces of clay and blood do not develop on their own in the wild. They are placed into the bodies of 14 so-called goddesses of birth who act as surrogate mothers for the new hybrid species. The original text uses the term shasuratu, which translates as wombs, and they act strictly on the orders of the project's chief engineer. Why would the gods need to use 14 separate incubators to gestate the first humans if this is simply a metaphor for ordinary human birth? The epic literally describes a mathematically precise process of waiting. 10 months they waited until the 10th month arrived, the month of opening. The 10-month lunar cycle corresponds exactly to the normal gestation period of a human fetus, demonstrating the ancient author's absolute medical accuracy. When the time comes, the goddess Nintu does not use magic. She physically cuts open the shells so that the hybrids can be born. The text describes this procedure using medical terms, indicating that the birth was a controlled and artificially induced process. You are not reading a poem about motherhood, but a protocol for extracting fully formed biological entities from surrogate chambers after incubation is complete. This detailed record of the number of incubators, strict maturation timelines, and surgical intervention at birth shatters the illusion of a simple myth. The text documents the mass production of a new species, where gods control every stage from DNA mixing to the final extraction of the fetus. This operation has nothing to do with natural evolution or the mystical creation of the world by the wave of a divine hand. An ancient document records the technological process of launching a population, where the first 14 individuals were the result of the successful completion of a laboratory experiment. And this detailed description of the procedure for gestating hybrids is still classified by science as a poetic reflection on the role of women in society. When we lay out all these ancient cuneiform texts on a single table, the scattered details begin to form a frighteningly coherent picture. You no longer see disjointed tales of gods and mud. You see fragments of a single large technical report on hybridization. Official science suggests we consider each of these strange elements in isolation, applying the universal label of poetic allegory to them. But if we simply read what is written, without trying to smooth over the rough edges, a clear protocol of actions will emerge before us. And this protocol describes a process that our own modern geneticists have only begun to understand in the last few decades. The preparation of the terrestrial biological substrate, called clay, by fragmenting and isolating it into equal portions. This is documented. The surgical extraction of the informational structure or personal code from the blood of an alien donor. This is also documented in the texts. The physical mixing of these two components until a completely homogeneous state is achieved to create stable, viable material. This is documented with frightening precision. The placement of the resulting embryos into 14 surrogate chambers and the strict monitoring of their maturation over the course of 10 months. This is documented. There is no logical academic explanation for why all 4 of these independent details point in the same direction. If this were simply ancient poetry, Why would the author have needed to invent such a complex and multi-stage process of artificial insemination and incubation? Why couldn't the myth have been limited to a simple divine word that would have created a human being from the dust of the earth in an instant? The presence of strict mathematical proportions, specific terms for blood separation, and descriptions of the physiological heartbeat demands a completely different level of analysis. These texts do not attempt to be metaphorical. They strive to be as precise as possible in describing events that the scribe likely simply copied. He was transcribing instructions whose meaning he may not have fully understood, but whose sequence he was obliged to preserve. We are faced with the fact that thousands of years ago, someone left detailed instructions for creating our species from two different materials. One half was taken from this planet to ensure our survival in the local gravity and harsh atmospheric environment. The other half was brought in from outside, providing us with structural complexity, the ability for deep analysis, and the capacity to understand complex commands. This dual nature, which the text calls a mixture of clay and the blood of a god, became the foundation of what we call humanity. And the ancient tablets insist that this process was an act of engineering, not a coincidence or a divine miracle. The academic world continues to argue that these conclusions are too literal and fail to account for the cultural context of ancient Near Eastern civilization. But to ignore the explicit medical and technological terms in the text is to deliberately turn a blind eye to the fact that the artifact speaks for itself. Every word, every cuneiform character carved into these clay documents was placed there with a specific and very concrete purpose. They wanted future generations to understand the mechanics of their origins, to know that mixed blood flows through their veins. And now that we possess knowledge of genetics, this ancient language of structural instructions suddenly takes on a frighteningly clear and modern meaning. Let's return once more to room 55 of the British Museum, where that very piece of clay lies under the artificial light of the display cases. Catalog number BM 78941 still rests motionless on its stand, surrounded by plaques bearing official and reassuring translations. It has survived the fall of great empires, millennia buried under tons of dry sand, and long journeys in the holds of archaeological expedition ships. Physically, this object remains exactly as it was at the moment when the ancient scribe finished pressing his symbols into it. But now, knowing the details of the process of mixing two biological lines, you can hardly look at it as a simple fairy tale. Official science looks at this small piece of fired clay and sees in it a beautiful allegory of man's connection to the earth. I look at those same cuneiform signs and see an ancient technical report on the successful genetic hybridization of two different species. Perhaps this is a far-fetched conclusion based on an overly literal reading of terms that have long since lost their original context. Or perhaps this is exactly what it so strongly resembles: a documentary record of the surgical mixing of local biomass with foreign blood. This choice between poetry and technology changes not only our perception of ancient history, but also our understanding of our own human nature. What is inscribed on this tablet challenges our fundamental belief that we are the sole architects of our own evolution. If the text describes actual events, then our consciousness, our so-called Temu, is not the product of millions of years of random mutations on Earth. It was deliberately extracted, purified, and implanted into the biological matrix so that we could perform functions unavailable to local species. We carry within us this drumbeat, this unceasing rhythm, which ancient texts call the echo of the slain donor god. It is a legacy that cannot be erased because it is literally the building material of each of us. Perhaps this is precisely why we continue so persistently to gaze at the sky, trying to find their answers to questions about our origins. We are drawn there not merely out of curiosity, but because half of our genetic code once did not belong to this world. The ancient Mesopotamian scribes did everything in their power to document this fact with the utmost precision available to their language. They left us this rock-solid evidence, hoping that one day we would be able to read it, not as a myth, but as a set of instructions. And now these instructions lie right before us, translated and cataloged, awaiting the moment when we are ready to accept them. The tablet of the Atrahasis epic is on display in a glass case at the British Museum right now. The question of whose blood exactly was mixed with the earth and clay in these ancient texts remains entirely open. No one can deny the fact that the words describing extraction, purification, and implantation are physically present on this ancient artifact. Translations of these cuneiform characters have been published and are available to anyone who wishes to verify the accuracy of these technical descriptions. This piece of clay, weighing about 1 pound, is documented evidence of the dual origin of humanity.